You're welcome back. 12 years ago, between 8:46 and 10:03 a.m., about 5 air flights had crashed into various buildings in the United States in New York. 4 of them had crashed into buildings including the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, while the other had crash landed. At about 9:40, the FAA had grounded all aircraft within the continental U.S. and aircraft already in flight were told to land immediately. And over 2,000 people, including the 19 hijackers and 2,977 victims, had been recorded as casualties in this very, very fatal attack. As 12 years down the line, we want to understand what happened. If you remember, there were a lot of readings into what exactly had gone down on that fateful day in New York. Have New Yorkers moved on? We also have the issue of Syria lingering around, even as New Yorkers seem to have moved on only but a little. With me in the studio is Irbard. He's a researcher in Middle Eastern He's a Middle Eastern researcher, and he's joined us with an understanding of what this could mean 12 years on. Thank you very much, Ibrahim, for your time.
You're welcome, Kimini, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. First, I want us to understand this 9/11 issue. Give us a brief background to what this 9/11 really.
Well, it was a brilliant Tuesday morning. The skyline was blue in downtown Manhattan when suddenly planes came plowing into tall buildings in the United States of America. And 4 aircraft were involved. That is by way of correction. 4 aircraft were involved. And when you look at the 571 pages of the 9/11 Commission, headed by the former governor of New Jersey, Thomas Keane, the official line is that it was an outside job. People who are opposed to the American culture and way of life sought to tarnish the image of America by killing many of its people. So the 19 people who were involved, surprisingly, a chunk of them came from the United States' greatest ally in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia. So 15 of the 19 hijackers, according to the 9/11 Commission report, came from Saudi Arabia. The remaining 4 were 2 people from Lebanon, another from the United Arab Emirates, and then the ringleader, who was Mohammed Atta. And he was an Egyptian. So the target was to hit America where it would pinch the most. And before 9/11, the helpline to the police in the United States was 911. So the timing was also cynical to make Americans think that what is a lifeline to you will be a death line after Tuesday, 9/11, 2001. So those people trained in the mountains of Afghanistan. Mostly they were at Kandahar and Helmand province in Afghanistan, where Osama bin Laden is seen as the architect of such an attack, because Osama had before then showed a willingness to attack America. We saw vestiges of that when he attacked their embassies in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998. And then a prelude to the 2011 attacks was an attack on America's warship off the coast of Yemen. That warship is called USS Cole. So a suicide bomber rammed a boat laden with explosives into that warship, and it eventually sank. So the previous things give us cause to believe that it was bin Laden who was behind those attacks, and in all those periods of time, he was the one bankrolling most of the activities of global jihad. So people put blame at the doorstep of Osama bin Laden. But we shall explain later why perhaps the narrative could be deceitful. Because if Osama bin Laden was indeed behind 9/11, the greatest witness to give testimony about why what happened on 9/11 happened would have been Osama bin Laden. So when the American Navy, Navy SEALs, the secret American agency that went into Abbottabad in Pakistan to kill him on the 2nd of May 2011, came close to Osama bin Laden, what prevented him from capturing the man alive? Because we wanted Saddam Hussein to give testimony to why he had gassed the people of Halabja in Iraq. He was captured alive, even though he was hunkering down in some pigeonhole at a farmland in Iraq. But what prevented them? An army of about 64 men who had gone into that building. What prevented them from capturing Osama bin Laden alive?
We'll talk about that, like you said, later on the program. But let's look at events after 9/11, which includes the attack on Iraq. Help us understand the relationship.
You see, the United States wanted somebody to hate as a form of a backlash. You know, it was a fallout from the attacks they suffered on that day. America is a very strong country, so nobody envisaged that somebody would attack America at his own backyard and cost the lives of over 2,000 people. Not even the Pearl Harbor attacks launched by the Japanese could cost as many lives as the 9/11 attacks did. But when you look at the targets, the World Trade Center, the two towers were hit. One was hit close to the top and the other was hit close to the middle. The other two targets were Pentagon, where America orchestrates all of its global military escapades. That was also a target. That was hit, but the impact was not as immense as what happened in Manhattan. And then the fourth plane was headed for the White House. But it still so happened that the people who were aboard that plane could eavesdrop on what had happened on other airlines. They were able to overpower the hijackers. And the main reason they were able to do that was that the original plan of Al-Qaeda was to throw in 20 men aboard those airplanes. But one Pakistani young man called Ramzi bin Yusuf al-Bin al-Bishir was the one who was lagging behind because of visa challenges. So later he was captured in Pakistan, and therefore he gave a lot of insight into how the attacks were prepared. So that airplane that did not hit its intended target was short of one hijacker. So there were 4 people. The arrangement was that you would have 4 people who were well trained, overpower the passengers on board. So one person would find his way into the cockpit and then pilot the plane to their intended target. But because they had heard the news, it was the last plane to have touched down. It crashed, unfortunately, in Pennsylvania. So it was headed for the White House. And only God knows how the world would have been by now if the White House was hit. But that notwithstanding, the U.S. wanted to show the world that it wasn't a lion you could play with. When you hit the tail of a lion, you should expect the roar, the uproar that will come from it. So immediately, they gave the Taliban, who had been in charge of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, they gave them a couple of hours to hand over Osama bin Laden, who was a prime suspect in that attack. But Mohammed Omar, who was a spiritual leader of Taliban, said the rule of the game is evidence. Before we hand over this man to you, give us evidence. And all that while, bin Laden already was a Saudi citizen. But because the Saudis do not agree with his line of thought and ideology and the fact that he was calling for attacks on American soldiers stationed in Saudi Arabia, his citizenship as a Saudi Arabian was revoked. So from there he went to Sudan, where he helped in a lot of construction works. And later, the Sudanese also asked him to leave because of pressure coming from the United States of America. So the only Muslim state that opened its doors to Osama bin Laden and his cohorts was Pakistan. And Taliban was the leader of Pakistan, and the Taliban were the rulers of Pakistan in those days. So they told the Donald Rumsfeld, George Bush, and Colin Powell that provides empirical evidence that this man was the one behind the attacks, and we will hand him over willingly. But the U.S. was not ready to provide any evidence. All that Bush was given was ultimata. He would give one ultimatum after another ultimatum, saying that they had to hand over the man or face the firepower of the United States of America. And unfortunately, they didn't reach eye to eye. They didn't find eye to eye with each other. And at the end of the day, negotiations were scuttled. And therefore, they invaded Afghanistan in October 2011. And we saw the repercussions. But when you look at all the wars America has fought since Vietnam, they haven't won any war decisively. So the Afghani expedition itself seems to be a failure right now, because right now they are trying to cajole the Taliban to sit around the negotiation table, because 12 years of war, they are wary of war, and therefore they want to pack bag and baggage to leave Afghanistan. And if care is not taken, the Taliban will come back and take over Afghanistan when they eventually go away. So in a nutshell, when they asked the United States, the CIA in particular, to provide evidence why they thought Osama bin Laden was behind the attack, they weren't able to do that, except that they cited the examples I have cited, that if anybody intends evil towards you, the malignant activities the person has done in the past could inform your conclusion that such a person was behind such an attack. So the Tanzania attack and then the Kenyan attack were the two things that the Americans stood on to point accusing fingers at Osama bin Laden. So the US invaded, and then in no time they were able to defeat the Taliban army. And Osama bin Laden and a few soldiers of his were cornered in Tora Bora, and unfortunately was able to slip and then enter into Pakistan. And all along, for those of us who have been researching into the region all these years, we have always said that the only regime in the world that is propping up the Taliban is the Pakistani regime. So if the Pakistani people really want jihad in Afghanistan and Pakistan to come to an end, they know the whereabouts of all those key leaders. Besides, when America started its drone attacks in 2004, they were able to kill most of Al-Qaeda's leaders who were ensconced in Pakistan. For example, they were able to kill Yahya al-Libi, a very prominent Al-Qaeda leader. Mustafa al-Yazid was also killed in a drone attack. All the important people who were spearheading global jihad were killed by the United States whilst they were ensconced in Pakistan. And therefore, Pakistan holds partially the key to the resolution of the current crisis in Afghanistan. That is why they should be permitted to sit around the table. But Kemeni, some also have another opinion that runs counter to conventional knowledge. That George Bush wanted to finish up a business his father, George Bush the Senior, couldn't finish. Because George Bush the Senior was the one who led the Americans into Operation Desert Storm, the first war that was fought in the Gulf against Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein survived that. So when Bush came, as somebody who had been raised up in a ranch in Texas, he was quite hawkish and bellicose. So when America was attacked, that gave him reason to launch attacks in those two important Islamic nations of Afghanistan and Iraq. But the classified documents show that the main reason America attacked Iraq was not Al-Qaeda.
I see. Because
they were not able to establish any nexus between the Saddam regime and Al-Qaeda. But they felt like Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. And if the Taliban were able to give safe haven to, people like Al-Qaeda to launch attacks on America, then such a man, Saddam Hussein, would also be able to give such weapons to such elements so that they would attack the United States of America. So one traitor from Iraq, when you look at CIA files, he's called Snowball. That is the pseudonym they have given him. He was working with the weapons department of Iraq, and he was able to jump into Germany. So the evidence they had against Iraq did not come from Washington. It came from Germany, because he had gone there and then he told them that Saddam Hussein possessed some clandestine weapons he was ready to use against the West at any point in time. He was able to give them documents and data to prove that. So all this while, when the Colin Powell was trying to convince the United Nations that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, he was relying upon the evidence and testimony given by Snowball. And this guy's cover has been blown eventually. And he can't go back to his country because he is a treacherous person who has made Americans cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. So the Iraqi campaign took place in March 2003. And in 3 weeks, Saddam Hussein was defeated. It was an unnecessary adventure by the US. Very, very unnecessary, because there were ways they could have treated the situation better than they did. But 9/11, unfortunately, cost many lives. But some think that it was an inside job, and they have reasons why they say so.
Inside job, as in the US had perpetrated that?
Yeah, they said it was a self-inflicted attack by the United States to have a pretext to attack certain nations in the world. Kemeni, when you look at the way the buildings came caving in on themselves, you could realize that they were not as a result of an outside explosion. They imploded. So something that dynamites were deliberately set in those buildings, the Twin Towers, downtown Manhattan. And then when the time came, the buildings just caved in. Those were multi-layered story buildings. And when you look at the Boeing aircraft that ramped into those buildings, they were too tiny to have caused the complete collapse of those buildings. So some scientists have come out with, mechanics and astrophysics and all that to explain that when you hit a building this way, when you hit a building this way, the worst that can happen is that there will be a lot of incineration at the apex of that building, but nothing should cause the 4 pillars of the building to come crashing. So therefore, they think the Americans were those who did that to have a reason. And another, you know, cynical reason people give was that most of the lobbyists in America are Israelis. And it is in the interest of Israel that belligerent states in the Middle East are attacked and defeated by the United States. And we are told most Israeli employees of the World Trade Center did not show up for work that morning.
I see.
So you can see the connect between the conspiracy theories people have been, you know, mentioning and what happened on that fateful day. So it still remains a conundrum. Many years ahead of us will tell whether indeed it was an inside job or it was something that was perpetrated by Al-Qaeda. But the weakest link in America's argument was that if they knew the prime suspect was Osama bin Laden, they should have captured the man alive. There's nobody to have told us that the attack was either carried by Al-Qaeda or otherwise, except the man you accuse of being the mastermind of such an attack. And when you went to that compound in Abbottabad, only 2 men were in that compound, in addition to that old man. Right. And the rest were women and children. What prevented the United States of America from capturing the man alive? That is a question we all have to ask.
What does that go to say about the U.S.?
Well, some of the people who took part in that operation said it was a shoot-to-kill operation. Right from day one, they had been told that this guy has to be killed. That was what they were told. That was the instruction the military commanders gave them. But they could have captured him alive. The narrative they give is that when they went into his bedroom, his wife came charging at them. So they felt like Osama bin Laden would go for an AK-47 or detonate a suicide belt he was strapping